March 1943, deep inside a secret room at German military headquarters in Berlin. No windows, just 6 men standing around a table covered with maps, charts, and radio messages, all marked in red ink. Outside, the German people still believed they were winning the war. But inside this room, the air felt different, heavier, like something terrible was about to be revealed. One officer held a report in his hands, and those hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. The numbers in that report told an impossible story. 26 German submarines lost in just 1 month. Allied convoys somehow avoiding German patrol zones with perfect accuracy. Enemy destroyers showing up exactly where German U-boats surfaced, as if they knew ahead of time. Then someone finally spoke the words nobody wanted to hear. "They're reading our messages." The Germans had always believed their Enigma code machine was absolutely unbreakable, the most secure communication system ever created. But the silence that filled that room in that moment said everything. The lamp hanging above the table flickered. Cigarette smoke hung in thick layers. Nobody moved. Rear Admiral Gerhard Martens slowly took off his glasses and set them down on the table. He'd been running U-boat operations for 2 years. He knew every patrol route by heart, every cipher key rotation, every security procedure. On the wall behind him hung a graph showing U-boat successes versus losses. In 1941, the line had climbed upward, victory after victory. In 1942, it had stayed strong. But starting in January 1943, that line collapsed like a cliff edge. One captain leaned forward across the table, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "If they've been reading our codes since 1941, then nothing we ever sent was secret. Nothing at all." Another officer shook his head in denial, unable to believe it. But Martens just stared at the map spread before them, studying the convoy routes and the patterns of how Allied ships avoided German submarines. It all fit together now, like pieces of a nightmare puzzle. Every Wolfpack ambush had been stopped before it could even begin. Every refueling location had been discovered. Every operational order had been intercepted and read by the enemy. The war beneath the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a fair battle anymore. It had become a trap, and Germany had been caught inside it for years without knowing. Let's go back to 1940, when this story really begins. The Enigma machine was Germany's greatest secret weapon, their crown jewel of technology. It could create 159 quintillion possible code combinations. It had rotating wheels, plug boards, and the cipher keys changed every single day. Mathematically, everyone said it was impossible to break. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed in Enigma completely, with total faith. He once said the enemy would need a miracle to break our codes. And then he smiled and added, "Enigma gives us that miracle." And for a while it really did work like magic. In 1940, German U-boats sank 471 Allied ships. In 1941, they sank 432 more. The Atlantic Ocean convoys bled ships and supplies, and Britain began to starve. Winston Churchill himself later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. German U-boat commanders became legends during what they called the Happy Time. Names like Kretschmer, Prien, and Schepke were celebrated as heroes. Dönitz kept expanding his submarine fleet, from 300 submarines to 400, and he dreamed of having 1,000. He promised Hitler that Germany would cut Britain's lifeline completely, achieving a total naval blockade by 1943. But then, something strange started to happen. Convoys began changing course at the exact right moments, zigging when they should have zagged according to German predictions. Destroyers appeared in empty stretches of ocean where no ships should have been. German Wolfpacks found nothing but depth charges and attacks. At first, the Germans thought it was just bad luck, or maybe bad weather, or perhaps the Allies had improved their radar technology. But by March 1943, the losses had become absolutely catastrophic, impossible to ignore. Dönitz demanded answers from his staff. And what they discovered was far worse than any torpedo could ever be. The intelligence officer laid out the investigation file on the table, page by page, and each page was more devastating than the last. January 1943, 6 U-boats lost, and only 2 successful convoy attacks out of 9 that had been carefully planned. February 1943, 19 submarines lost, and only 1 successful attack. March 1943, just the first 3 weeks, 15 submarines lost, and 0, absolutely 0, successful convoy attacks. The room went completely silent as the officers absorbed these numbers. Finally, one officer broke the silence with a desperate theory. It must be their radar technology. It has to be radar. But Martins shook his head slowly. He'd already investigated that possibility thoroughly. Allied radar systems couldn't detect a surfaced submarine beyond 5 miles, especially not in fog or at night. But somehow, Allied convoys were changing their routes 50 miles before any German submarine even arrived, rerouting their paths hours in advance, as if they knew the exact coordinates where the U-boats would be. And the terrible truth was, they did know because they were reading Germany's encrypted messages. The intelligence officer turned another page, revealing more damning evidence. Convoy HX-2229 was supposed to be intercepted at coordinates 42 degrees north, 48 degrees west. The German Wolfpack was deployed to that exact location. But the convoy had diverted 60 miles south before any U-boat even transmitted its position. Convoy SC-122 was set for a planned ambush at 52 degrees north, 35 degrees west, but Allied destroyers were already waiting there, and the U-boats were depth-charged on their approach before they even made visual contact with any enemy ship. There was a classified refueling point in the mid-Atlantic codenamed Seawolf, a location that was never broadcast over radio, kept completely secret. Yet Allied bombers arrived within 2 hours of the rendezvous time as if they'd been invited. One word kept appearing again and again in the margin notes of the report: precision. This wasn't luck or guesswork or coincidence. The Allies weren't just reacting to German movements after they happened. They were reading the operational orders before the German submarines even received them. Martins looked up from the file, his voice completely flat and factual, drained of emotion. If this is true, then every single coded transmission we've sent since 1941 has been compromised. Every operational plan, every patrol grid, every supply route, absolutely everything. The officer standing across the table rose to his feet, his face pale as death. Herr Admiral, if the British have been reading Enigma for 2 full years, then he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood the implications instantly. The entire Battle of the Atlantic, every attack, every loss, every strategic decision, every tactical move, all of it had been fought under the enemy's watching eyes. On March 10, 1943, Admiral Dönitz sat alone in his office at U-boat headquarters in Paris. The report from Berlin lay open on his desk in front of him. For 2 solid hours, he didn't move at all, just sat there staring at the pages. Outside his office, his staff continued their work. Radios crackled with transmissions. Typewriters clacked out reports. The normal business of war operations continued as usual. But inside that office, inside Dönitz's mind, the war had already fundamentally changed. Dönitz was not the kind of man who panicked easily. He'd commanded submarines himself during the First World War. He'd personally built Germany's U-boat arm from just 57 boats into a fleet of over 400 submarines. He understood military risk. He understood combat losses. But this situation was something entirely different, something far worse. He read through the casualty lists one more time, forcing himself to see the truth. March 1st through March 10th, 1943. U-91 sunk in the Bay of Biscay. U-130 sunk in the mid-Atlantic. U-432 sunk near Convoy ON-166. U-444 sunk at coordinates 48 degrees north and 28 degrees west, with no distress signal sent and no survivors found. Each one of these submarines had transmitted its position using Enigma encryption, and each one had been found and destroyed by Allied forces within just hours of sending that transmission. Dönitz picked up a pencil and began writing notes in the margins of the report, tracking dates and locations, looking for patterns in the data. Then he suddenly stopped writing. He looked up at the map mounted on his office wall. Colored pins marked the position of every active U-boat in the Atlantic Ocean. Red pins for submarines that had been sunk. Black pins for submarines still active on patrol. White pins for submarines returning to base. There were far more red pins than black pins now, and the pattern was unmistakable. For months, Dönitz had blamed the losses on bad weather, on fuel shortages, on improved Allied air cover, on better sonar technology. But none of those factors could explain what he was seeing in this report. This systematic pattern of interception and destruction. There was a knock on his office door. His aide entered the room and stood at attention. Herr Großadmiral, the staff is asking whether we should continue with Operation Sea Teufel. Dönitz didn't answer immediately. Operation Sea Teufel, which meant Sea Devil in English, was a coordinated assault on Allied convoy routes using 38 submarines, the result of weeks of careful planning, with all the encrypted orders sent via Enigma communication. He looked down at the report again, seeing the patterns of Allied interceptions. If the British really were reading Enigma messages, then Sea Teufel wasn't a battle plan at all. It was a death sentence for 38 submarine crews. "Cancel it," Dönitz said quietly, his voice barely audible. The aide blinked in confusion. "Sir, cancel the operation completely," Dönitz repeated, his voice growing stronger. "Recall all boats to defensive positions immediately. No new offensive operations until further notice. But Herr Großadmiral, the Führer is expecting results from this operation. We can't just—" Dönitz stood up from his desk, his voice now cold and final. "Tell the Führer that the Atlantic has become a graveyard, and we have been digging our own graves with every single message we send through our communication system." The aide left the office quickly. Dönitz sat back down in his chair and stared at the map on his wall for a long time. He didn't know exactly how the British had managed to break Enigma. He didn't know precisely when they had achieved this breakthrough. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The war beneath the sea was not just being lost in the present. It had already been lost years ago, and nobody in the German military had realized it until this very moment. The investigation began immediately after that realization. The German High Command formed a special secret commission, bringing together the best cryptographers, naval intelligence officers, and signals experts they had. Their task was clear but terrifying: determine once and for all whether Enigma had truly been compromised by the enemy. They worked in complete secrecy, because even speaking this question out loud felt like treason against the Reich. For 3 intense weeks, they tested every possibility, every theory, every scenario. Theory number 1. Maybe there was a mathematical weakness in the cipher system itself. The mathematicians ran all the calculations over and over. The numbers were clear: 159 quintillion possible settings, with cipher keys changing every single day, using a 3-rotor system that would soon be upgraded to 4 rotors. Their conclusion was definitive. Breaking Enigma through pure mathematics alone would require decades of computational work, which was completely impossible with current 1940s technology. Theory number 2. Perhaps the Allies had captured Enigma materials from sunken or boarded submarines. The commission reviewed every single incident where German vessels had been captured or boarded by enemy forces. Yes, U-boat U-110 had been captured by the British in 1941, and codebooks had been taken from it. Yes, U-559 had been boarded in 1942, and cipher materials had been seized. But those captured keys and codebooks expired and changed within just days, sometimes hours. Captured materials could explain maybe days or weeks of compromised communications, but definitely not years of systematic code breaking. Theory number 3, operator error and sloppy security procedures. The Commission examined thousands and thousands of transmission logs, looking for patterns of mistakes. They found some problems, yes. Some radio operators had reused the same phrases repeatedly. Some had sent weather reports in predictable, recognizable formats. These were rookie mistakes, violations of proper procedure. But the Allies weren't just reading the poorly encrypted messages sent by careless operators. They were reading everything, every single transmission, even the ones sent with perfect procedure. One of the cryptographers, Dr. Ludwig Stummel, finally put the situation into simple, stark terms. If the enemy is truly reading all of our radio traffic, then they have either somehow broken the Enigma machine itself through methods we don't understand, or alternatively, they have managed to place intelligence sources inside every single U-boat command center, every naval station, and every cipher room in the entire Reich. He paused to let that sink in, then continued, "One scenario is mathematically improbable to the point of impossibility. The other scenario is logistically impossible to the point of absurdity, which means, gentlemen, that we are facing something we simply do not understand, something beyond our current comprehension." The Commission presented their findings to Admiral Dönitz on April 1, 1943. Their conclusion was written in careful, bureaucratic language, but the meaning was absolutely terrifying. We cannot confirm with certainty that Enigma has been broken by the enemy, but we also cannot confirm that Enigma remains secure. Dönitz read the entire report twice, slowly and carefully. Then he asked the only question that truly mattered for the war effort. If we assume that Enigma has been compromised, what does that mean for the conduct of the war going forward? The room fell into heavy silence. Finally, one brave officer spoke up, his voice shaking. "It means, Herr Großadmiral, that for approximately 2 years, we have been systematically sending our submarines into ambushes that we ourselves arranged through our own communications. It means that every patrol order, every rendezvous point, every attack coordinate was delivered directly to British destroyers before our own crews even received their orders. It means that the enemy has not been fighting us in a fair battle. They have been hunting us like animals, and we gave them the map to find us." Dönitz closed the file folder slowly. The logic was completely inescapable, undeniable. Germany had built what they thought was the most sophisticated naval cipher system in human history. They had rotated the encryption keys daily without fail. They had trained their radio operators rigorously and thoroughly. They had enforced strict radio discipline across the entire fleet. And absolutely none of it had mattered. Not one bit. Because somewhere across the English Channel, in a country mansion called Bletchley Park, in a room full of brilliant mathematicians and engineers working in total secrecy, the impossible had somehow happened. Enigma had been broken, utterly defeated. Not through lucky captures or through espionage or through stolen materials, but through something far worse from the German perspective. Through pure intellectual power and human genius. A team of minds working together in secret had achieved what was supposed to be impossible. They had built machines designed to think faster than human brains could think. They had detected patterns in billions of encrypted messages that no human eye could ever see. The Germans had put all their trust in mathematics and the laws of probability, and the British had simply out-mathematized them, out-thought them, outsmarted them at their own game. And the cost of this failure, the human cost, was staggering. Dönitz looked up at the casualty board mounted on his wall. The losses for 1943 to date: 63 U-boats destroyed, representing over 3,000 German sailors dead. And these men had not been lost in fair combat, not lost in honorable battle. They had been lost because the enemy could read their orders before they could. Because every move had been telegraphed in advance. He picked up his pen and wrote a single line in his personal diary. a line that captured the entire nightmare. We are fighting completely blind while the enemy sees absolutely everything we do. And then came one final, even more terrifying realization, one that made his blood run cold. If Enigma had been broken and compromised, then how much else of Germany's military communications had been penetrated? What about army communications on the Eastern Front? What about Luftwaffe operations and Air Force coordination? What about logistics and supply chain orders? What if the entire German war effort, across all fronts, across all branches of the military, had been completely transparent to the Allies for years? What if every strategic decision, every major offensive, every defensive position had been known to the enemy in advance? The room suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in. Donitz stood up from his desk and walked slowly to the window, looking out over occupied Paris stretching below. The city that appeared so secure, so safely under German control. Or was it? "Gentlemen," he said quietly, still not turning around to face the other officers in the room, "we have been losing this war for much longer than any of us knew or understood. And there is no cipher machine, no code system, no encryption technology that can save us now." The new orders went out quietly through the German military command structure. There was no formal public announcement, no official admission of failure or compromise. But by May 1943, the evidence of disaster was undeniable to everyone involved. May 1943 became known as Black May in U-boat history. 41 submarines sunk in just 1 month, representing over 2,000 German sailors lost at sea. Donitz made the painful decision to pull all remaining submarines from the North Atlantic hunting grounds. It was the first strategic retreat of the entire U-boat war, an admission of defeat. Hitler demanded explanations and answers, growing furious at the sudden change in strategy. Donitz gave him technical reports about Allied improvements, better radar, more aircraft, new escort carriers protecting the convoys. He never once spoke the word Enigma to Hitler, never revealed the true depth of the intelligence disaster. Some officers in the German High Command absolutely refused to believe the machine had been broken. "The Enigma machine is mathematically perfect," they insisted stubbornly. "The Allies are simply getting lucky, that's all. Just a statistical anomaly." But the numbers told a completely different story that couldn't be argued away. From 1939 through 1942, German U-boats had sunk an impressive 2,800 Allied ships, a devastating toll. From 1943 onward through the end of the war, German U-boats sank only 600 Allied ships, less than a quarter of the previous rate. The Battle of the Atlantic didn't end with some dramatic final confrontation or climactic naval battle. It ended with silence, with withdrawal, with defeat. German submarines made fewer and fewer transmissions. They conducted shorter patrols. They adopted a defensive posture, just trying to survive. By 1944, U-boats were operating under strict radio silence whenever possible. They used old-fashioned, dead-reckoning navigation, manual coordination, and basic tactics from the First World War era. They had stopped trusting the machine that their entire strategy had been built upon. But by that point in the war, it was far too late to matter. Allied convoys now flowed freely across the Atlantic Ocean. American factories poured endless weapons and supplies into Europe. The logistical preparation for D-Day moved forward without any significant interruption. The greatest weapon that Germany thought it possessed, the ability to communicate in an unbreakable code, had actually been its greatest vulnerability and fatal weakness all along. After the war finally ended, the truth emerged slowly, piece by piece. The world learned about Bletchley Park, the secret facility known as Station X. They learned about the bomber machines, the electromechanical devices built specifically to break Enigma. They learned about Alan Turing and the thousands of dedicated codebreakers who had worked in complete secrecy for years. The Allies had broken Enigma as early as 1941, achieving what the Germans thought was impossible. And they hadn't done it through luck or chance. They had done it through sheer brilliance, through mathematical genius, through relentless determination. But perhaps even more impressively, they had hidden their success perfectly. So perfectly that the Germans never figured it out until far too late. The Allies never acted on every single decrypted message they intercepted, because doing so would have immediately revealed their advantage to German intelligence. Instead, they used their knowledge strategically and carefully. They would reroute one convoy here based on intercepted intelligence. They would ambush one U-boat there, but they always maintained plausible deniability, always had cover stories ready. Oh, it was radar. Oh, it was aerial reconnaissance. Oh, it was a lucky intelligence leak from a captured prisoner. The British intelligence services made absolutely sure that when German investigators looked into the pattern of Allied successes, they would find anomalies, they would find suspicious patterns, they would find reasons to be concerned, but they would also find reassurance. They would find technical reports and mathematical proofs that said Enigma simply cannot be broken. It's impossible. And so the Germans kept using Enigma even as doubt slowly crept into their minds, even as the losses mounted higher and higher, even as the evidence accumulated. Why did they keep using it? Because admitting that Enigma had been compromised meant admitting something far worse and far more painful than just a technical failure. It meant admitting that the entire war, from almost the very beginning, had been fought with the enemy reading over their shoulder like a teacher watching a student take a test. It meant admitting that every brilliant strategy, every clever tactical decision, every carefully planned operational order, all of it had been known to the enemy in advance. It meant admitting that Germany's most advanced technology, their greatest achievement in communications security, had been utterly defeated not by spies or traitors, but by pure minds and mathematics, by people who were simply smarter and more creative. It was psychologically easier to believe in bad luck, to believe in superior Allied radar technology, to believe in tactical errors made by individual commanders. It was far easier than accepting the truth that they had been comprehensively outthought by the enemy. Admiral Karl Dönitz survived the war and faced trial at Nuremberg for war crimes. During his testimony, when he was asked about U-boat operations and strategy, the subject of Enigma security came up. Dönitz said carefully, choosing his words, "We suspected compromise was possible, but we could never prove it conclusively during the war." By the time we fully understood the scope of the problem, there was nothing left to protect anymore. The prosecutor pressed him harder. "Admiral Dönitz, when did you personally realize that Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic?" Dönitz paused for a long moment, staring into space, remembering. Then he answered honestly, "March 1943 is when I knew for certain." But in truth, we had actually lost that battle 2 full years earlier, back in 1941. We simply didn't know it yet. We kept fighting a war that was already over. Today, if you visit the Wright Museum in London, you can see an original Enigma machine sitting behind protective glass, silent and harmless now. Beside it, there's a small placard with simple text that reads, "The breaking of the Enigma code is estimated to have shortened World War II by approximately 2 years and saved countless lives, fundamentally changing the course of human history." But that placard doesn't mention the other side of that story, the German side, the human cost. It doesn't talk about the German sailors who transmitted their coordinates faithfully and then never returned home to their families. It doesn't mention the U-boat commanders who sent encrypted orders into what they believed was a secure void, trusting in their technology. It doesn't speak of the intelligence officers who suspected something was terribly wrong, but couldn't prove it until far too late to save their comrades. The lesson of Enigma goes far beyond World War II history. War is never won by bullets and bombs alone. War is won by information, by intelligence, by knowing what the enemy doesn't know that you know. Germany had the machines, the engineering brilliance, the military discipline, the trained operators, the rigorous procedures. They had everything except one crucial thing. But the Allies had something more valuable than all of that technology. They had the mathematicians and codebreakers who could see patterns that were supposed to be invisible, who could solve puzzles that were supposed to be unsolvable, who could break codes that were supposed to be unbreakable. And in the final analysis, when everything was said and done and the war was over, that intellectual advantage made all the difference between victory and defeat. The story of Enigma teaches us something profound about warfare and about life. Even your greatest strength, the thing you trust most completely, the advantage you think is unassailable, can become your fatal weakness if you're not careful. If you become overconfident, if you stop questioning your assumptions. The Germans never imagined that Enigma could be broken because they had too much faith in their own mathematical genius. And that absolute faith, that certainty, that refusal to believe the impossible could happen, that's what destroyed them in the end.